The Patriots of Boston were stockpiling weapons, and Thomas Gage was going to find them. He heard a rumor that a farm owned by a man named Amos Barrett was a trap house for American blickies. The town of Lexington was on the way to the Barrett farm. That's where the British encountered the American militia and ended up killing 8 of them. The British weren't going to be stopped from enforcing the law this time. It was easy for Americans to tar and feather scrawny tax collectors, but another thing entirely to stand face to face with the king's soldiers. The fact that 8 Americans were killed on Lexington Green was a symptom that the rules had changed. The British weren't up for compromise anymore. They were going to find those weapons, and so the British troops marched on to the next town, the town of Concord. Concord was ready for them. Messengers had already told them the news about what happened at Lexington, and were in the process of spreading the news to other nearby towns. The Minutemen of Concord got in position. Minutemen from other nearby towns were on their way to help. When the Minutemen from the town of Acton arrived, they found British troops blocking their way into town on a bridge, and these troops had already spilled blood that day. As the Acton men marched closer, the king's troops opened fire, killing Captain Isaac Davis. Davis's men then split up and fired back at the British from every direction. The British got disoriented and ran away, back towards Lexington, in the direction of Boston. As they moved towards Boston, they saw more Americans arrive from every direction. Militias from all over the Massachusetts countryside were coming out. They fired on the British from behind walls, trees, barns, and bridges. Bullets whizzed in every direction. The British fired back, and some Americans ran away. But for every American who did, there were 2 more coming to take their place. The British had never seen anything like this before. The entire country was up in arms against them. By the time the British reached Boston, 72 of them had already been killed. From the Boston hilltops, they saw Americans coming from every direction. Every town, every man, every gun in Massachusetts was headed their way. As April turned to May, General Gage watched men from New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, all of New England come to the defense of Massachusetts. An American army was forming before his eyes, much larger than his force of professional soldiers. And the Americans weren't just coming to Boston. A pair of Connecticut men, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, led a force into upstate New York to capture the British fort Ticonderoga, which served as a gateway between New York and Canada. The British were using it to store artillery, but didn't really defend it well. The place was falling apart, so when the Americans showed up in May, they didn't have much trouble in taking it. All of the artillery at Fort Ticonderoga became theirs. Meanwhile, Americans continued to flood into Boston. They occupied the hills outside of the city, looking down at the British Army, resplendent in their red uniforms. In the distance, they could see more red uniforms coming off ships. The Americans on top of one of these hills, called Breed's Hill, built a system of walls and defenses to defend against the British attack that was bound to come. The hill was close to the water, where the mighty British Navy freely operated. On the morning of June 17th, artillery from those ships opened fire on the Americans on Breed's Hill, raining cannonballs down on them. At the same time, British troops started marching up the hill in perfect order, beating drums to keep the pace. General Thomas Gage was joined by other generals, including William Howe, and they knew that an American militia was no match for the British Army marching in formation. The Americans stood ready behind their walls, watching the British get closer as artillery continued to roar through the air. The beat of the British drums got louder. The British men got bigger, and all the while, the Americans stood perfectly still, waiting. When the British got to around 20 steps away, the Americans opened fire, mowing down rows of soldiers. But the ones who weren't mowed down continued to march towards them. Americans fired another volley. Some more British were mowed down, but still, the British kept coming. The Americans ran as the British came within bayonet range. The British had won the Battle of Breed's Hill, known to history books as the Battle of Bunker Hill, but it didn't feel like a victory. The British lost over 1,000 men, while the Americans half that much. And for what? For one hill outside of Boston. The British Army, the most sophisticated military on Earth, was pushed to the limit by a mishmash of untrained country boys. The Continental Congress, who were meeting for the second time in Philadelphia, called on a man named George Washington to turn these country boys into a unified force, what would be called the Continental Army. They chose him because he had some experience from the French and Indian War, where he built a reputation as a man of integrity. He was also a wealthy plantation owner, so he wouldn't need to be paid. And he represented the largest of the 13 colonies, Virginia. Washington arrived in Boston on July 2nd and saw that he had his work cut out for him. His men only signed up for 8 months of duty. What was going to happen when they went home? He needed to recruit more men, which was a constant problem throughout the war. Also, the British commanded the seas, which allowed them to land as many as 10,000 troops in the city under General William Howe. They also had artillery, while the Americans had none. Most alarmingly, there were still thousands of loyalists in Boston, and they were looking for ways to help Howe's men. And why wouldn't they? The British were winning so far, and they ruled the city like kings. What could Washington do? His men only had control over a few hills. They could defend themselves, but they'd never be able to drive the British out of Boston. They needed artillery of their own, and Washington knew exactly where to get some: Fort Ticonderoga. In November of 1775, he sent a man named Henry Knox to bring that artillery from the fort into Boston, a distance of around 300 miles. 300 miles of rocky, forested, icy terrain with no roads. He used horses and sleds to drag the heavy guns through dense forest and over frozen lakes. He did reach Boston, which became one of the greatest accomplishments of the entire war. Washington now had artillery of his own with which to batter the British. Howe and his men were forced to get on the boats and leave Boston to set sail for Canada. As Washington turned the tide in Boston, enslaved human beings on his plantation back in Virginia started to escape. They headed to Virginia's capital, Williamsburg, where the governor, Lord Dunmore, promised them freedom if they joined his army. Dunmore was losing control of Virginia. While fighting was taking place at Lexington and Concord, Dunmore confiscated all the gunpowder he could find so that patriots wouldn't have access to it. He was determined to hold on to Virginia for the king, but it didn't work. A militia led by a man named Patrick Henry drove him out of Williamsburg and took control of Virginia. Dunmore then fought back using every white Southerner's worst nightmare, a slave rebellion. He promised every enslaved person in Virginia freedom if they would join his army. Over 800 of them answered the call and created what was called the Ethiopian Regiment. But he didn't bother to train them properly. So when he rushed them into battle, they had to retreat to an island, and many of them died of disease because Lord Dunmore didn't bother to vaccinate them either. Dunmore had accomplished nothing but to turn white people in Virginia against him. It was a bad decision. Virginia was in the South, whose economy depended on British trade. Many of them were probably loyalists, but no white Southerner, whether patriot or loyalist, would ever tolerate a slave rebellion. Dunmore's decision caused fear throughout the South, especially in states like South Carolina, where the black population outnumbered the white. And just to be clear, Dunmore didn't do this out of the kindness of his heart. In his mind, a slave rebellion was the last resort, but he didn't bother to take care of the human beings that joined his side. So even enslaved people saw the British as kind of half-assed friends. Meanwhile, in South Carolina's largest city, Charleston, a free black man named Thomas Jeremiah was accused of preparing a slave revolt with the help of the British. White South Carolinians arrested and tortured him, but Jeremiah never confessed to anything. The British governor of the colony, William Campbell, tried to pardon him, but the white people in South Carolina would not allow that. Jeremiah was hanged and then burned, while Governor Campbell stood by telling them they were killing an innocent man. But this didn't do much to assuage white people's fears in South Carolina. After all, the slaves still lived among them, and there was always a chance that the British would use slave rebellion to even the odds. Plus, Charleston was the biggest seaport in the South. Governor Campbell was not going to let the British lose it. In June of 1776, British General Henry Clinton and Admiral Peter Parker attacked Charleston from the sea. But their ships were too big to maneuver in the shallow waters. White militiamen, ginned up with fears of slave rebellion, fiercely defended the city against them. They fired on the British like the men of Lexington and Concord. Clinton and Parker were forced to break off the attack. It should have been easier for the British in the South, considering there were so many loyalists there. But bad decisions turned many Southerners against them. And if the British were pissing off Southerners, then something was wrong. 1776 was the year things went completely off the rail for them.